Millions of people wake up every day, yet only a few ever truly awaken. We live in a world where people mistake comfort for peace, noise for purpose, and belief for truth. But what happens when the illusions fade? This isn't religion. This is remembrance. And the truth will change everything you thought you knew. What matters most is remembering that every belief we inherited was shaped by human hands long before we ever learned to think for ourselves. As this wise quote articulates, we are all tattooed in our cradles with the beliefs of our tribe. You cannot educate a man wholly out of the superstitious fears which were implanted in his imagination, no matter how utterly his reason may reject them. Oliver Wendell Holmes, 1809 to 1894. From the moment we are born, superstitious beliefs, the kind that encourage people to accept something as truth without evidence, are stitched into our minds like invisible tattoos. Before we learn to walk, before we form our own thoughts, we are told what to worship, what to fear, and what to obey. For many of us, Christianity and religion in general was never a choice. It was inherited. It was tattooed onto our consciousness from the cradle. But here's the actual facts. When beliefs are inherited without question, we must become aware of how those beliefs end up serving the powerful far more than they have ever served the people. For centuries, religions have been used not simply to uplift, but to control, to divide communities, to justify oppression, to keep entire nations docile while the powers that be exploit people's desires, interests, and faith, all while harvesting the labor of the poor and feasting off the natural resources of their lands. Please understand, none of what I'm revealing erases the beauty of having faith in God. It doesn't dismiss the spiritual hunger that lives inside every human being, but it does demand something many never dare to confront. So I ask you, whose interests are truly served when our minds are branded? The cradle-to-grave conditioning of religion was never just about God. It has always been about power. It has always been about keeping people in line while wealth and influence flow upward. And if we are ever to reclaim our spiritual clarity, if we are ever to free ourselves from the illusions and superstitions that have divided humanity, we must gather the courage to question the tattoos we never asked for. Far too many religious followers are either in denial or unaware that the theological authors of their holy books borrowed from ancient mythological religions that existed long before their theocratic ideologies ever took shape in this world. In some instances, the writers simply changed the names of characters, but were expected to ignore historical facts and accept that the words inside the Torah, Quran, and Bible are inspired by God or considered to be the undeniable truth. Yet if any individual were to research the historical documentation, the archaeology, the comparative mythology, the linguistic evolution, they would undoubtedly learn that the words in these holy books were written by men of ancient times, and certainly not by God. Yet once a narrative is stamped with divine authority, people stop questioning the men who wrote it and start fearing the consequences of doubt. This fear becomes so deeply rooted that entire generations accept inherited myths as prophecy, even when history shows those prophecies repeatedly failing to materialize. And once these human inventions are elevated to divine forecast, people begin treating ancient expectations as if they were unfolding in real time. Each generation inherits the same recycled warnings, mistaking old anxieties for new revelations, never realizing these so-called prophecies have been echoing unchanged for thousands of years. What religious followers tend to overlook or refuse to acknowledge is that the same "we're in the last days" rhetoric they declare today was shared among Jesus of Nazareth's followers over 2,000 years ago. But obviously, we're still here. No apocalyptic occurrence, no Jesus Christ cracking the sky riding a chariot powered by heavenly horses. For more than 2 millenniums now, tens of billions of people have died believing in that myth, with their efforts, time, and tithes evaporating into nothingness. If I may, allow me to cast more light upon the peculiarity of prophecy. A former Christian pastor, Durante Lamar, articulates an important truth, one rarely spoken from the pulpit. If the Bible is supposed to be batting 1,000, then what do we do with the pitches that miss completely? It makes clear predictions, and some of them flat out flopped. Take Isaiah 17, Damascus will be a ruinous heap, never inhabited again. The problem, Damascus is still one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on earth. Or Ezekiel 26, Tyre will be destroyed, never rebuilt. Wrong again, Tyre was rebuilt, Tyre still exists to this very day. Or Ezekiel 29-30, Egypt will be conquered, desolate, and never rise again. Tell that to the 110 million people living in Egypt right now. And let's not forget Jesus in Matthew 24. This generation will not pass away until all these things happen. Spoiler alert, that generation passed away. The temple fell, but the end of the world, still waiting. By the Bible's own standard, Deuteronomy 18:22, if even one prophecy fails, the prophet is false. Not mostly true, not close enough, false. Prophecies that flop don't make it into the church highlight reel. As alluded to previously, tens of billions of human beings have come and gone believing in antiquated scriptures and ancient myths, expecting outcomes that never materialized. Yet the emotional dependence that kept them tethered to these fantasies did not stay confined to religion alone. It began shaping something else, something far more dangerous, their politics. Because when Scripture replaces critical thinking, political choices stop being about evidence and start becoming about allegiance. In that moment, the mind is no longer evaluating truth, it's defending inheritance. It begins when we stop mistaking tradition for truth. When we remember that the divine is not confined to books, buildings, or dogmas, because it lives in the breath, the silence, the uncorrupted, natural-born sense that's still within us. For many of those who have awakened, it took years, years of searching, years of breaking, years of surviving, and almost a lifetime's worth of pain to understand that everything they'd been taught to believe was never meant to set them free. Because awakening is not the moment you find new answers. It is the moment you stop accepting the old ones. It is the moment you recognize that the chains around your soul were forged long before you ever learned to speak. Awakening is a revolution that begins inside. It is the first time you breathe without someone else's permission, the first time you see without someone else's lens, the first time you question the narratives that were tattooed onto your consciousness before you ever had a chance to understand the world for yourself. And once this awareness begins, even faintly, nothing can silence it. Because once you see that the prison was built inside the mind, the next step is realizing who built it and why. Throughout their religious conditioning, their conscious coma, people were taught that God was some man in the sky. And in similar fashion to how cults operate, it convinced them that they were natural-born sinners, that they were never to question the will of God, that they needed a pastor, a priest, or a holy book to connect with the divine. And then it instilled the fear of burning in hell for eternity if they did not abide by the God of said religion. Never mind the fact that you're actually a good person who exuded positive energy while practicing good deeds throughout your time in this world, because according to the doctrine, if you don't follow, praise, and worship their God, your soul is going straight to hell upon demise. At its foundation, religion takes advantage of people by giving them something to hope for, heaven, and something to fear, hell. It caters to a population's greatest desire, then weaponizes the fear of hell to scare its followers into exercising compliance. Yet and still, people persist in allowing themselves to remain brainwashed into believing they'll receive salvation through obedience instead of through awareness. By such manners of teaching, religions build faith, trust, and dependence on a business model built from a foundation of illusions. Under such unfortunate circumstances, the powers that be are comfortable knowing they do not have to fear future rebellions from the masses. However, there's one thing they always fear: a society that has finally and fully awakened. It's the very reason why the wealthy elites have been investing, endorsing, and enforcing superstitious religions for hundreds of years on Earth. They are fully aware that disconnecting the masses from learning historical truths and misguiding them in ways that prohibit them from discovering the power within their naturally divine selves makes it easier to program their minds to believe in falsehoods, fantasies, and illusions. Once that is accomplished, people become easier to control, easier to manipulate, and more susceptible to depending on corrupt political systems that never truly serve their best interests. Hence, the rich get wealthier as the middle and poor classes of society get poorer. And when a society reaches that point, the damage doesn't stay confined to their minds. It ripples outward into every institution they rely on. What emerges next is the predictable collapse of fairness, dignity, and truth. And when truth becomes distorted as institutions lose credibility, people cling to whatever voice promises certainty. It's precisely this hunger for guidance that opens the door for religious authorities to shape the public's perception of reality. Once a population is trained to surrender its critical thinking to religious authority, it becomes equally unprepared to recognize political sleight of hand. The methods may differ, Republicans claiming divine approval, Democrats claiming democratic legitimacy, but the goal is identical: keep the masses obedient, while power consolidates itself. Furthermore, much of the rifts, conflict, and division between the two parties are carefully planned out and staged. A theater of distraction, a political performance designed to blind the people from the machinery moving behind the curtain. In confronting these truths, we must turn to one of the most incisive thinkers of the 20th century, Malcolm X. His fearless analysis cut through illusion and laid bare the political strategies that shape America. He articulated a vivid picture of how its two dominant parties operate, which read as follows: among whites in America, the political teams are no longer divided into Democrats and Republicans. The whites who are struggling for control of America's political throne are divided into liberal and conservative camps. The white liberal differs from the conservative in only one way. The liberal is more deceitful, more hypocritical than the conservative. Both want power, but the white liberal is the one who has perfected the art of posing as the Negro friend and benefactor. And by winning the friendship support of the Negro, the white liberal is able to use the Negro as a pawn or a weapon in this political football game that is constantly raging. The American Negro is nothing but a political football, and the white liberal controls this ball through tricks and/or tokenism. In this game of deceiving and using the American Negro, the white liberal have complete cooperation of the Negro civil rights leaders who sail our people out for a few crumbs of token recognition, token gains, token progress." End quote. Malcolm's warning, echoing across generations, is only the beginning. What Malcolm exposed still echoes today, because betrayal doesn't always come dressed as an enemy. Often it arrives wearing the face of supposed allies. When politicians prioritize access to power over accountability, they leave entire communities defenseless against the quiet rise of inequality. And when inequality becomes normalized, silence itself turns into a collaborator. In such a climate, the moral cost of looking away becomes just as damaging as the systems that engineer the suffering. Albert Einstein said it best: "The world is in greater peril from those who tolerate or encourage evil than from those who actually commit it." Because tolerance of injustice is not neutrality. It is participation. And the silence of the misled becomes the soundtrack that power plays behind. The powerful know this, they always have. And what rises next is far more dangerous than political deceit alone. If we strip religion of its sentimentality and look at its promises through a moral lens, something disturbing begins to happen. Because the idea of heaven, a realm of eternal joy existing alongside eternal suffering, depends on the suspension of empathy. It demands that religious believers find peace while others are condemned to unimaginable agony. To experience bliss in such a system, one must emotionally detach from compassion itself. Please know, detachment isn't holiness, it's pathology. In psychological terms, it's moral disengagement, a learned ability to rationalize harm as divine will. So heaven's peace by its own logic depends not on love, but on the believer's capacity to silence it. You cannot grieve the lost, mourn injustice, or be disturbed by the cries of those who didn't make it. To maintain peace, you must call cruelty, justice, and indifference faith. This is the quiet conditioning that shapes hundreds of millions of religious minds. Each time someone says, "Leave it in God's hands," or "Let God be the judge," they're training themselves to feel calm and be at peace in the face of other people's sufferings and injustices. Over time, empathy erodes. It gets replaced by a moral anesthesia disguised as righteousness. For religion at its most tribal form doesn't reward compassion, it punishes it, because compassion ruins the illusion of divine order. A society that teaches peace through detachment from pain isn't a moral society, it's sociopathic by design. And once empathy is severed from faith, the doors swing wide open to political cruelty. The same theology that numbs believers to eternal torment easily numbs them to hunger, poverty, and war. And that is why so many can watch families starve, children pulled from rubble, and still believe the suffering is justified, either by God or by government. Truth is, no God, nor prophecy or supernatural act is delivering such atrocities. What we're dealing with are human beings in powerful positions who are making decisions that shape government policies. Policies that ultimately declare wars, determine how we live, and define what we experience throughout our lives. Those who are left out of those policies are nothing more than human consequences. But rather than confront the human hands behind injustices, many turn inward, clinging to small personal blessings as proof that a higher power favors them and is intervening on their behalf. This inward gaze becomes a shield, one that protects the believer from acknowledging the larger, more disturbing truths that are terrorizing the world. In this settled, narrow, selfish space of comfort, spiritual conditioning quietly replaces critical thinking. For example, whenever something pleasant unfolds in a religious believer's life, when they feel a moment of emotional warmth during prayer or experience a small stroke of fortune, they immediately declare, "God is good." Their personal comfort becomes the evidence. Their moment of relief becomes the testimony. But when unimaginable suffering takes place, when children are swept away by floods, starved, abused, or wiped out by disasters they never deserved, religious people proclaim God works in mysterious ways. Suddenly the logic changes. Suddenly the rules bend. This is how blind faith sneaks around reality. It pushes the goalpost back when you kick the football, then tells you to keep playing the game as if it's fair. For anyone who's paying attention, for anyone who's awake, this double standard isn't just tiring, it's morally disturbing. Because what's being celebrated is not divine compassion, but a form of spiritual narcissism. God blessed me. God solved my problems. God made my worship feel good. Yet this same God refuses to intervene for a starving child, a trafficked girl, a tortured prisoner, a mother praying over her dying baby. When you zoom out and place these claims next to the reality of human suffering, the notion of it all becomes obscene. Because to think that way is to abandon honest reasoning. It is to decide that your personal comfort matters more than the agony countless others are experiencing right now. This kind of religion trains the mind to ignore the suffering of other human beings, as long as you feel spiritually rewarded. And that's the troubling part, because a belief system that demands emotional loyalty at the cost of human empathy creates a dangerous moral condition. It teaches people to detach themselves from the pain of the world. It convinces them that tragedies are divine plans. It conditions them to justify cruelty as part of God's will. Religion in this form isn't offering moral clarity. It's offering a psychological escape hatch that breaks the link between conscience and compassion. And once people start believing that atrocities are acceptable as long as they serve some unknowable divine purpose, they become numb to injustice. They become comfortable with the suffering of others. They become willing to rationalize violence, oppression, and even genocides, all while calling it a practice of faith. That isn't spirituality. That isn't morality. That isn't love. That is a dangerous detachment from humanity, dressed up as devotion. It is the erosion of conscience, disguised as piety. It is the abandonment of empathy, rebranded as obedience. And it creates believers who can witness horror and call it holy. We see this clearly today. As millions of Americans, many who call themselves Christians, demonstrate no outrage towards the ongoing genocide occurring to Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, or when the government just recently suspended SNAP benefits that feed millions of poor families. Clearly, the moral compass has collapsed in America. The powerful know this, and they exploit it. The millionaires and billionaires perfectly understand that they'll never get the tax cuts they need to become trillionaires, so long as food stamps, healthcare, and human service policies exist. And religion, stripped of empathy and chained to ideology, is their most useful ally. Heaven may promise peace, but if that peace requires blindness to suffering, then it isn't heaven at all. It's the death of empathy. And in a society where empathy dies, power doesn't remain still. It expands, it deepens, it tightens its grip on every institution the people depend on, because a population that no longer feels cannot resist. And that's exactly what the powerful have always counted on. If these words stirred something in you, a question, a memory, a forgotten truth, then your awakening has already begun. Because awakening rarely arrives with lightning or miracles. It begins quietly, in the moment when something inside you whispers, something isn't right. Awakening is the moment you stop borrowing beliefs and begin reclaiming your own mind. It's the moment you realize that inherited doctrines, rituals, fears, and traditions, no matter how sacred they appear, were created by human beings long before you ever learned to think for yourself. It's the realization that much of what you were taught was designed to guide your obedience, not your liberation. Your awakening deepens the moment you recognize that religion's greatest grip was never its promise of heaven, nor its threat of hell. It was the belief that you were powerless without it, the belief that you must not question, that you must not think for yourself, that you must fear your own mind. But awakening is the rebellion of the spirit, the recognition that the divine has always lived within you. Not in a building, not in a book, not in the hands of the powerful. Awakening is remembering that. You were born with intuition. You were born with conscience. You were born with the ability to feel truth before anyone ever told you what truth should be. Awakening is not abandoning God. It's abandoning the illusions that kept you from knowing the divine within yourself. And when this clarity finally emerges, when the illusions fall away, something powerful happens. You reclaim the empathy that religion tried to mute. You reclaim the courage that fear tried to silence. You reclaim the vision that indoctrination tried to bury. You begin to see through the political games, the religious conditioning, the systems that benefit from your blindness. You begin to understand why the powerful fear collective awakening more than rebellion. Because a society that is awakened, truly awakened, cannot be controlled. Awakening is not a destination. It's a return to your own consciousness, a return to your own moral compass, a return to the truth that lived in you long before fear taught you to ignore it. This is not the end of your journey. This is the rebirth. When you reach this point, you are no longer listening as the person you once were. You have seen through the narratives that shaped your fears, your beliefs, and your loyalty. You have recognized the systems that used your faith as a leash and your hope as collateral. And whether you realize it or not, your awakening has already begun. For awakening is not a moment. It is a direction. It is the decision to question what you were taught, to reclaim the intelligence that was buried beneath tradition, to reconnect with the divine wisdom that lives inside your own consciousness, and to refuse, with love, clarity, and courage, to ever again surrender your mind to superstition, manipulation, or fear. The world you live in today is suffering not because people are evil, but because people are asleep to injustice, asleep to manipulation, asleep to their own power. And when a society sleeps, the powerful dream for them. But when a society awakens, the powerful tremble. You are no longer a spectator in this world. You are a participant in its transformation. Your awakening holds weight. Your awareness carries influence. Your shift in consciousness disrupts systems that have stood unchallenged for centuries. And you are not alone. Millions around the world are waking up at the exact same moment. This is not coincidence. This is consciousness realigning. And if these words stirred something in you, a question, a memory, a forgotten truth, a vibration you haven't felt in years, then your awakening is already in motion. But every awakening needs guidance, history, context, story, and truth. A map to help you navigate the illusions you were born into. That is why Divinity Travels was written, not as entertainment, not as doctrine, but as a companion for the awakened. A true story of consciousness, suffering, faith, corruption, truth, and ultimately, liberation. A blueprint for seeing the world as it truly is, and seeing yourself as you were always meant to be. If you are ready to continue your awakening, if you are ready to peel back the final layers, if you are ready to reclaim the truth that was taken from you since the cradle, then take the next step. Go deeper, read Divinity Travels, discover the story that started it all, and join a movement of awakened minds who refuse to sleep through their own existence. Visit DivinityTravelsBook.com and begin the journey that your spirit has been waiting for.